Okay, so motor control. For those of you who are very interested in motor control, there is this fabulous book, Motor Control, Translating Research into Clinical Practice by Shunwei Cook. It's on the reference list, it's in the library. Most of you probably won't need that kind of level of detail, but some of you might be really interested in it. But it talks about the different theories of motor control all the way through to different intervention approaches. So it's just if you need to know more about it because you're going on a particular placement or it's an area of interest, that's a really good book to use. So what we're going to look at now is define motor control, and we'll think about the interaction between the task, the person and the environment. Touch on some theories of motor control and explain how this relates to motor relearning, and you can start to see, hopefully, when we talk about motor relearning, how you can use strategies when you're developing your interventions. But you'll look at this more in the second year. So really, motor control is about our ability to organise our movements, to organise the sensory processes, the sensory information that is coming in so that we have effective sort of motor outputs. And it is central to our understanding of movement. So it's movement that's already acquired as well. So you've already got those movement skills. How do you actually organise those? And when you think about the complexity of the human body and the human system, then organising even the smallest of movements takes a lot of processing. If you're a computer, the kind of capacity of the computer to control movement in that way is starting to understand the difficulties of that with things like robotics. Motor learning then is how do you acquire movement or modify the movement that you've got. So this is the how that you might learn motor skills, and we're interested in the how because if we're working with people with motor deficits, we might be then helping them to learn new movements. But with OT, we're often learning new movements within the concept of the task. So we might not be practicing a particular movement because that might take us more into the world of physiotherapy, but we need to know what are the movements required in order to be able to brush your hair or wash your face or enter something onto your computer, into the laptop. How do we organise those movements, and how might we teach someone to do that if they've got motor difficulties? And motor relearning is, like I said earlier, it's about the processes and the recovery of movement and function. So the kind of modern day thinking about motor control is very much reliant on systems theory. So you've come across systems theory lots of times by now, have you? Yeah. So it's sort of kind of, the idea is it's a self-organising system, but you've got things influencing the system and you've got outputs, and then one thing changes and then it has a roll-on and a massive effect on other aspects of the system. But traditionally, we kind of thought about motor control as being predominantly reflexive, and it was very sort of related to the maturational theories that we talked about earlier on with Arnold Gessel. So reflex and hierarchical theories have the same sort of idea. Hierarchical talk about that movement is controlled. You've got the higher brain centres, sort of your prefrontal motor cortex, and then you've got the lower brain, sort of thinking about the cerebellum and then the spinal cord, and that there's that hierarchy of importance and which part of the body actually controls the movement. We now realise it's much more of a sort of a network basis. So it might be that movement originates in one place, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's at the top of the hierarchy. And it isn't quite as simple as that. Systems theory, an influential physiologist, Russian physiologist, Nikolai Bernstein, he developed something called the problem of the degrees of freedom. So he was interested in, if you're eating something. You know, if you're going to reach for a cup and to pick it up to drink it, if you think about all the variations that you could have in terms of the different degrees of movement of each joint, the different planes of movement for each joint, the different amount of contraction and relaxation of the kind of synergistic muscles, it's an almost infinite variety of ways that the body could solve that problem. So how does it solve that problem? And that was kind of the way that he started to understand movement. And because of Nikolai Bernstein, he started to really realise that, and he kind of brought mechanics into the idea of motor control, that a lot of it was influenced by things happening within the environment. So if you're going to pick up a cup, then the amount that you open your hand to grasp the cup is determined by the size of the cup. You know, the amount of contraction or effort that you put in is partly determined by the weight of the cup. He talks about the impact of gravity, that we have to learn and we understand how gravity affects our movements. You know, so we're kind of working against resistance sometimes. Sometimes we're working very much against gravity. Other times gravity is assisting you with movement. You know, if you think about putting something down, then gravity is assisting you with that. If you're picking something up, then you're going against gravity. So he talks about the role of the environment and how we have to kind of coordinate movement and sensation, and the way that we interact with the environment. So he also thought that sensation was really important as well. So the idea of systems theory and the degrees of freedom is that actually what happens is we kind of convert the body into this controllable system. So it isn't as random as having an infinite number of ways of doing something. We develop patterns of movement very quickly. And in the early stages, you will see that children, as they're moving, we talk about gross movement, but they might actually sort of fuse different parts of their body together, different joints, so that it acts as one. Does that make sense? So, you know, if you're thinking about a child originally walking, when they're starting to learn to walk as opposed to when they are proficient at walking, you will see that there's much more sort of flexion and extension and movement of different joints. So it might be that the walking starts off and it looks quite stilted because they don't have the ability to control all the different joints in the same way. So they might actually kind of, you know, fix two joints together. They might have less movement at their hip and knee or less movement at their knee and ankle so that it's easier to move. Do you follow me? Does that make sense? So as you become more proficient, then you start to increase the fluidity of the movement, and then you have more difference in the movement of the different joints. And with adults, we talk about the ability for selective movement. So whenever you're doing something, you have to understand, where do I need to be stable and where do I need mobility? And it's a constant compromise between stability and mobility. So if you're reaching for something, you need to be stable, and you're standing, you need to be stable in your legs, your hips, your trunk, in order to fix all of that so that you can have mobility distally, you can have mobility in your elbow, your wrist and your hand. And if people aren't able to stabilize themselves, then the mobility starts to be affected as well. So you need proximal stability for distal mobility. And that's partly come out of this idea of how does the body resolve this kind of complexity of movement. It's also, our understanding of motor control is also affected by ecological theory. So this is just the idea that we're trying to explore the environment. We're not just passive recipients of what's going on around us. We're actively, sensorily processing and perceiving the environment and exploring the environment. And so the environment becomes key to influencing people's motor control. The bit that's missing off the slide is here. This is an M, which is movement, motor control. So our motor control, our ability to execute sophisticated, successful, smooth, efficient, goal-orientated movement arises from an effective interaction between the task the environment, and the person. So for the person, we need to think about their central nervous system and their peripheral nervous system. So you're thinking about, their ability to perceive and to feel. It's that, if you think about when you've been to the dentist and you've got a numb face, and how easy is it to talk when you've been to the dentist? And that it's not because he's paralysed all the muscles, it's because you can't feel anything. It's the same thing when you've sat on your leg for too long and you've got pins and needles, or whatever it is. It's that you're trying to move without the sensation of movement, of feeling. Sorry, you're trying to move without the sensory input. Means that your movement becomes less effective. So we know that sensation is absolutely vital to effective movement. And of course there are different kinds of sensation. Have you looked at proprioception in physiology? Yeah? So proprioception, anybody know what proprioception is?
Knowing where you are in space.
Yeah, without looking. Yeah. So it's the sensory input to knowing what the position you're in. And that can be affected by different kinds of conditions. So people can have movement but poor proprioception. It's quite common after a stroke, and you might have reduced proprioception in their affected side. And then that then means that when they're not looking, they can't tell whether their foot has cleared the floor. They're much more likely to catch it and trip over something. So they might need to compensate for the lack of sensation by looking a little bit more at what they're doing and looking at the floor. Your musculoskeletal system is going to affect your motor control, and it's recognising this. So the example I always give, if you look at very elderly people, it's quite often they start to develop a kyphosis. You come across the kyphosis? Yeah, so it's a curvature of the spine, and a kyphosis is a front to back curvature. I can't remember the technical term. So it's this sort of or that kind of stoop that might happen when somebody is a very elderly adult. And what happens then, if you've done your shoulder anatomy, have you done the shoulder girdle? No. Okay. If you want to put your hand above 90 degrees, like this, what you need to do is you need to be able to articulate and move your scapula. And if your spine is flexed, then it restricts the movement of the scapula. And then you can't get past 90 degrees without possible pain and causing damage to the shoulder. So somebody who has changes in the musculoskeletal system is going to have different kinds of movement and different sort of motor controls. So it's important to look at somebody's posture, somebody's positioning, the joint integrity, whether they've got sufficient length of muscles, ligaments and tendons in order to be able to get full range of movement. Because if someone doesn't have the full range of movement, then their movement output is going to be different. Cognition, we talked a bit briefly last week about the role of cognition and movement. So they're related, you need to be able to attend to what you're doing, and we know that if people have severely impaired cognition, it then impacts on their motor control. So their movements are likely to be slower, less efficient, they may be more clumsy. So cognition is an important part of movement. I think sometimes we kind of forget about that, really. Same with motivation and mood. And of course, if people are depressed, then they may actually have psychomotor retardation, which means that their movements are actually, everything is slowed down. So psychomotor retardation. I forgot my pen, so I can't write these things up, actually. It's like a brain with me. So they're actually moving they're more slow in their movements, they're more slow in their thinking. So it's not just about physical things that affect people's motor control. There are other issues as well. And increasingly we're becoming aware of how important it is that the person is able to integrate sensory input effectively in order to have successful motor output. And we understand this a lot from children, and particularly where children might have sensory processing difficulties. So that may be, in children with things like ASD, where they have, issues with sensory processing. It's going to affect their motor output. The other thing that affects motor control then is the task. And this is where we come in as OTs, isn't it? Because we're really good at task analysis. And in terms of movement, what we're thinking about, we want to know how complex the task is, because that's going to affect our motor control. We want to know about the affordances of the task, and of the objects within which we're using them. So object affordance is when you see an object, you kind of relate to how that object needs to be used, how heavy it is, how does it move. If I'm going to move the chair I understand roughly before I even touch it, the weight of it, the resistance, because it hasn't got wheels, of what it's going to be like moving across the carpet, and the way that I might choose to interact with the chair. Object affordances and task affordances are interesting because when you're little, when you're a child, the affordances of the chair are very different to when you're an adult. So as a child, that might not be a chair, it could be a mountain or a den or a robot or whatever it is, and they will interact with it very differently. Whereas for an adult, it's a chair, isn't it? When you sit on, or you might stand on it if you need something, but predominantly we sit on it. So the things within the task kind of almost dictate to us what we're required to do with them. We also have functional groupings of tasks. So I guess the best way to think about this in occupational therapy is really about, it's almost like the skills bit. You've got an activity, and you've got within the activity, let's say the activity of getting out of bed, there are groupings that need to be associated with that. So you need to be able to roll in bed. You need to be able to move from supine to prone, or depending which way you lie. You need to be able to transfer your weight. You need to be able to move from lying to sitting. Those are kind of called functional groupings. So any task will have kind of functional groupings that you need to do, movements. We have to think about what's the opportunity of the task, what are the requirements of the task in terms of how much mobility does it need and how much stability does it need. So I'm not quite sure what I meant with this, because effectively, and I think this is probably where it is looped around, the more mobile the task is, the more attention it requires of you. That makes sense, doesn't it? So if you're lying down, it's not very demanding for you. But if you're, typing quickly onto a computer, or you're running around, or you're doing something like they're playing football up there, it requires a lot of attention to do that. So effectively, it's as you become more mobile, the attention resources increase. I think what I meant was that as the demands of stability, so it's not about how stable you are, but how difficult it is to stay stable. So if you're sitting down, it's not too bad, but if you're standing on one foot, stability becomes harder to maintain, and it requires more attention as well. And we're interested with the task about whether they're open or closed. So an open task is one that is variable. Yeah? So a closed task is very predictable. And an open task is one where there's a lot of variability in what might be expected. So if you think about answering the phone, oh no, I'm going to get you to do that. Let's think of another example. That's why it popped into my head. Let's have a look. If you think about writing a letter, is there a lot of variability in that task of writing a letter, or is it quite predictable?
Compared to what?
Huh?
Compared to what?
Well, no, just within the task. I suppose. Well, you could compare it to playing football. Yeah. No, but in terms of movement, it's quite a predictable task, isn't it? So with an open task, there's a lot of variability, and this often means that there are other things moving and happening in an unpredictable way that require you to respond to them. Whether within the movement is the task discrete or continuous. So we're talking about movement-based tasks here. So just some of the language might be confusing. So discrete tasks would be sitting down on a chair. It's got a clear beginning and a clear end. You sit down and that's it. Whereas if you think about walking, it isn't. Yes, of course, you eventually stop walking, but it's a repeated pattern of movement, isn't it? Yeah? So it's considered to be continuous movement, and you could kind of stop almost at any point in time. Okay, so just take a few moments in your rows or your groups to think about football versus using a mobile phone, right? And I want you to think about how complex, which is the most complex task? What are the task affordances? What is it that kind of is required of you to interact? Are there any movement groups that need to be done? Is it discrete, continuous, stable or mobile, open or closed? Just have a go at applying some of those techniques. In terms of movement, motor skills, motor control, which is more complex? Using a mobile phone or yeah?
You mean soccer?
Yeah. You can call it soccer. Okay, so what is it about football then that's making it so complex? So think about these other things. So, is it a discrete or continuous motor task when you play football? Yeah. Is it do you need more stability or more mobility? But inherently it's a mobile, it's a more mobile task. So more mobility. You obviously need to be able to stabilise, and the demands are quite high when you've got one foot off and back to kick. You're talking about very high level balance, and we should be able to do that. But inherently the task is talking about mobility. What would be the functional grouping? Can you think of the sorts of movements that you need to be able to do to play football? Kicking, running, yeah, just stand on one leg.
You've got to have your eye, not hands, eye, but then foot, eye coordination.
Yeah, so there's aspects about the sort of, when we talk about the importance of the task, what's required, what is it you're interacting with within the task of football? Balls.
And the other people
Yeah. So the other people, they would mean, is the task predictable or variable? Is it open or closed? Very open task. Yeah. Okay. And the ball. What are the affordances of playing football in terms of the ball?
Material, size, weight.
Yeah. Size, weight. Can you do anything with it? Because there are the rules out there as well, yeah. So within football, the affordances of the task and the ball are that you use your foot. You can pick it up only in certain special circumstances.
You use pretty much anything except for your hands.
Yeah. So there is kind of the way that you interact with the ball is determined by the game. You cross the basketball with it in the middle. Yeah. Then you also need to be able to dive to the ground and look injured. But depending on the role, you might need to be able to dive, jump, other sorts of aspect, functional grouping. Jump, throw. You might need to throw. You can tell I don't know much about football. I can't remember. I never throw the ball. You throw it from the side. Huh?
Yeah, you can throw a ball.
So, but you just can't throw it when you're in the game. I don't know. So these are the sorts of things that football requires us in terms of movement. What about using a mobile phone? How complex is that, movement-wise? Forget the cognitive aspect, but the movement, the motor control required to use a mobile phone. No. It's fairly simple. It's nowhere near it's much less complex than football. Is it a continuous or closed task? Fairly close to it. I mean, you might sit there with it for about an hour, but it's kind of hasn't really discrete. There's one lot of movement. You pick it up, you put it to you hold it there, and you put it back. Most of it. Yeah, technically. So it's mostly closed, but it could, depending on what you do.
Because I thought that football might be, I can get that it's continuous in one way, but usually it's discrete, just an end to the game.
Yeah, I think you have to think about the movement. So whether, like I said, with running, with stand up and sitting down, you generally stand up and that's the movement. It's done. Yeah, or you sit down and it's done. But when you're walking, it's not just one step. It's one step followed by another, followed by another. So it's sort of continuous stream. Now you've got to stop and start at some point. There's always a beginning and end, but it's about whether or not it's sort of is it a rolling pattern of movement, or is it very discrete, beginning and end at once? What are the affordances, tactical or the affordances of the phone? What do you need to know about the phone that might influence your movement? Your motor control. Heavy, size. Yeah. If it's a touch screen, you might be, it's about the sensitivity.
Keypad.
The keypad, yeah, so. Touch screen, yeah, so these sorts of things. What else? You said it's sort of a closed, is it an open task or a closed task? How predictable and reliable is using a phone? Yeah, so there's not a lot of variability, is there, when you're using a phone? And you'll see people do pretty much the same thing with a phone over and over again. I've got closed, right, so let's skip ahead. Discrete, continuous. Yeah. Okay?
So it's discrete per se, yeah.
Yeah. And so you can use these ideas to analyse a task and try to understand what might be the motor control required to do these tasks. And what kind of, as OTs, be integrating it into daily living tasks. Movement is, are you okay? It's hard to talk above everybody, so please don't chatter in the middle of the lecture. So, by analysing the motor control requirements of the task, it means that you can have a sense of how complex it's going to be for somebody when you have a sense of what their motor control is like. And of course, the last part of that kind of person, environment and task element is the environment itself. And really what we're looking at here are two aspects of the environment, whether it's what are the regulatory features versus the non-regulatory features. So the regulatory features are the elements of the environment that really are absolutely essential for the movement, or will absolutely require you to interact with them for the movement. So the example, we go back to drinking a cup of tea. The tea is part of the environment. So the regulatory features of drinking a cup of tea are going to be how hot it is, what kind of cup is it in, how heavy is it, what the shape of the cup is, because all of these things will mean that you interact with it in a different way. Non-regulatory features are going to be other aspects of the environment, but they're not essential to the task. So it may be, the temperature of the room that you're in, or the general noise level. What you've got to do is sort of kind of filter them out, but they're not part of the task itself. They're not essential to the task. It's sort of an aside. Right, so what I'm going to do is show you the little video. I think I'm going to put it in here. No, I'm not going to put it in here. I'm going to put it in a couple of slides. Okay, sorry. I've changed it slightly. So, we're understanding motor control by analysing the person, the environment and the task. And we're using these different ideas to give a sense of how complex it's going to be and what the demands might be. So now moving on to motor learning. And motor learning is influenced by theories of learning. So a lot of it can be cognitive. So there are cognitive aspects in motor learning. It's not just kind of physically repeating and doing something. And when we look at learning theories, I'm not going to go into them in great detail, but we look at these key aspects of learning. So with learning, we're thinking about whether it's explicit learning or implicit learning. And if you remember when we talked about memory last week, we talked about explicit memory and implicit memory. And we talked about procedural memory, so the knowledge of how you do things. So that's kind of implicit learning as well. The riding of the bike is implicit sort of motor learning. It's the learning of how you do something. And explicit learning is the learning that you can sort of say and you can express. So, that might be explaining some mathematical theorem or talking about an occupational therapy model, those sorts of things. With implicit learning, you can also then have associative or non-associative. And associative is where it's associated with the stimulus. So if you go back to Pavlov and his dogs, or, it kind of relates into conditioning. So whether it's actually associated with the stimulus or not. And then, relates back to things like classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So as OTs, we tend not to use those so much, and we think more about sort of learning from experience, procedural learning, and we'll also talk about use declarative learning when we teach people things like cues to help them structure and control their movement. So this is an example of a cue that somebody may be given when they're learning how to stand up from a chair if they've got problems with mobility and transfers. So you'll hear a therapist direct them to bring their nose over their toes. And it's a cue, a strategy that they use that reminds them to bring their head forwards before they start to stand. And it's just understanding that movement. You can't stand up if your weight is in the back of the chair. You've got to move your centre of gravity forwards in order to be able to stand. So we might teach people these sorts of cues to help them prompt their movement more effectively. And there are lots of theories about motor learning, and really we're going to look at the Gentile's two-stage model of skill acquisition, because that is used, it kind of comes from sports physiology, and a lot of the theory about motor learning comes from that background. And that's quite a shift in healthcare, because a lot of our kind of underpinning knowledge was hierarchical reflexive theory, and some of it came from observations of therapists over the years who developed these sort of theories. And what's happened is we now understand the central nervous system and development in a more effective way, and understand that those theories don't work. So we're kind of now developing our understanding of motor control from things like animal experiments and sports physiology and physiology in general. So you'll hear about motor programs, which is why I've kind of highlighted it. There was a theory that actually what happens is we develop motor programs, we develop schema for movement. So can you remember last week, one of the, we were talking about schema. Who was it who had schema as part of their theory? Anybody remember from last week? Anybody remember? The cat and the dog, developing schemata for understanding. Huh? Piaget, yeah. So he talks about cognitive schema, and Schmidt talks about movement schema. So the idea is that the reflexes form building blocks for movements, and those building blocks then become motor programs. So you'll kind of come across this if you're doing any reading around motor learning. But we're going to look at Gentile, because Gentile has been quite influential in terms of thinking about how we treat people, certainly adults who have motor difficulties. And Gentile developed this two-stage model of skill acquisition, which I'll explain in a moment. But the first stage is about understanding task dynamics, and the second stage is about learning whether you actually fix your movement patterns or you learn to diversify those movement patterns. But I'll show you the video and then we'll talk through the explanation. It's quite sweet, actually. So, Gentile's model tells us that the first stage when someone's trying to learn a new movement is that they need to understand the purpose of the movement. What's the goal of the movement task that they're trying to do? And from there on in, they then need to develop their movement strategies. So what kinds of movements, how are they going to control it? They need to be thinking about accuracy. They might need to be thinking about the strength. They need to have an understanding of what are the environmental features of the tasks that they're doing. Okay, so if we just go back to picking up and drinking a cup again, it's understanding the purpose of the task, because so what you're trying to do is get the cup successfully to your mouth without pouring it all over yourself, which can be quite difficult. What's the environmental features? Well, how you interact with the cup. What's the size of it? How heavy is it? How hot is it? So, if you're using a paper cup and the person squeezes it too hard, then they get water everywhere. So it's learning about how to interact with that. You can see with her, it was kind of understanding, actually what is it that you need to do? How much force do you need to kind of put into hitting the ball? And then thinking about what's essential for the task and what things need to be ignored. So having that key understanding of what's going on within the task. And then in stage 2, what you're noticing is that now it's about refining the movement. So it's increased efficiency and increased accuracy, increased success, and increased adaptability. So they need to be able to adapt the task to changes within the environment and within the demand. So the cup's a good example. It might be a large mug that's quite light with a hot cup of tea. It could be a bottle of water that's cold different grip shape, plastic bottle so you can't squeeze it too hard. It could be a can of Coke, that you've had to open in a different way. They're all picking up a drink and drinking it, but they all require different levels of movement, different hand grips, different amounts of calibration and strength in order to be able to successfully drink that. So for a task that's very predictable, what you're looking at is the ability to repeat that particular movement the same way over and over again. So, I don't know if this is an exact good example, but this is how I feel about, if I ever have time to play an Xbox game, then, it's whoever you're playing, they've got to jump that ravine and grab a rope and shoot somebody at the same time. And it requires a certain combination of buttons. And the only way to get them, if it's Lara Croft, the only way to get her across the ravine is eventually you learn the precise timing of when those buttons have got to be hit in what order. You can't vary it because she'll just plummet to her death. It's got to be the same. Yeah? So that's a very close task. And the more you practice it, the more fixed it becomes. And it needs to be that way to be successful. Okay? Whereas if it's an open task, like kickball, you need to be able to have the versatility and the variability. She needed to be able to change what she's doing in response to the speed at which the ball was heading to her. She needed to be able to kick it, whether it came to her left or her right, or was going to go behind her, or, she needed to be able to do those things. So the more adept she becomes at the task, the more variability she has within that. So you can see those two different aspects depending on the movement. And why is this important, you may ask yourself? Well, what Gentile's model tells us is that practice is really, really important. So practice is key to developing motor skills. Now, you may think that sounds really obvious, and it does, but the reality is that, until a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, if you'd had a stroke, for instance, and you were in an inpatient setting, you might be lucky. Well, actually, even now, I think that the last audit I looked at, the average stroke patient got about 20 minutes of OT a day. 20 minutes on average. The requirement is that they have a minimum of 45 minutes of therapy from an occupational therapist per day. When you think about Gentile's model, if you're looking at movement, if somebody's got impaired hand function and you're trying to help them relearn and develop those motor skills, 20 minutes a day, even if it's just 20 minutes on that, it's not going to be enough. So Gentile's model tells us that practice is really, really important, and it matches in with some of our understanding we have now about intensity and frequency and neuroplasticity. So doing something a couple of times isn't going to work. I keep trying to tell my daughter that, playing piano for 3 minutes a week is not going to help her learn to play the piano. She needs to do it more often than that. And also the type of practice. So if you just keep repeating the same thing over and over again, so it's very variable, it's very predictable, that's not going to help you develop a motor skill that requires you to have a lot of variability. So just standing and throwing a ball against the wall and catching it again is not going to prepare you for playing netball, or, in itself it's not enough. So practice needs to be sometimes blocked practice, which is very repeatable. That would be just throwing and catching the ball, would be blocked practice. Or it needs to be, but eventually it needs to be random, which is what happens in a game. Somebody throws the ball to you, you've got no idea where it's coming from next or what's going to happen to it. So the same way, if we're thinking about, somebody's ability to open and close their hand effectively, giving them exercises that open and close their hands isn't going to work. You want to get them to use it within a functional activity. So if I'm, getting dressed, or if I'm making my breakfast, my hand function and the movements that I'm doing are very variable. They're changing all the time. And so that's why everyday tasks are really good for developing motor skills, because they are random in the way that they get into practice. They also need to change in the environment, so the constant changes in environment also helps the variability of the task. We know that feedback is important, so you can see the coach was giving her some feedback. They get feedback of the movement, which is sort of intrinsic. You get feedback from the results about how successful. You know, if you've got a cup of coffee and you just throw it all down your front instead of in your mouth, it's feedback, isn't it? That didn't work. Yeah? So you need that constant feedback to know how successful you're going to be. And that's the knowledge of results, you know, feedback at the end of the tunnel. What Gentile's model and Hoa also tells us is that mental practice can be very useful as well. And we're using this more and more in therapy, and they use it in sports. So visualising, imagining actually what will it be like to achieve this particular jump or to do this particular move. And in therapy, there are programs for, you know, intensive mental practice when people haven't got movement. So they imagine, what would it be like for me to pick up a cup with my left hand? What would it feel like? What's the weight of the cup? Can I feel the warmth of the cup through my hand? How does it feel when I'm picking it up and drinking it? And they spend time, kind of imagining what this might be like. And there is some evidence that when they do the functional MRIs and people are doing these sorts of imaginary movements, that it's triggering the same parts of the brain that would be responsible for the movement if it was actually occurring. So that's why we're starting to use things like mental practice. So the key thing for me, and you could write down your own 2 key points, but the key take-home point for today is this interaction between the person, the environment, and the task, the movement. So we constantly need to be thinking about those interactions. When you're understanding the complexity of movement, you'll see these terms all over and over again. What's the stability versus mobility of the task? In terms of development, is it central or is it proximal? So tasks are more more distal, and they tend to be more complicated. So thinking about development, and when we look at people who have movement as adults, we're interested in what's their proximal control like, central control. If they have limited central control, it's going to affect their ability to control their hands, their physical movement. So if they can't do that themselves, we need to provide them with control. So we talk about kind of proximal control and distal control. And this matches in with ideas of growth versus fine motor skills and patterns. Key ideas that we carry on with regard to use in terms of therapy, and the predictability and the variability. The other thing that Gentile's model tells us is that if you're working with somebody and the grip that they're using to pick up the cup changes every time, then we know that we're still in stage 1. They haven't moved on to stage 2. They haven't fixed it yet. And so if they've got ineffective movement, they're more amenable to change. Once there's a loss of variability in somebody's movement, it's become fixed, it's much, much more difficult to change that movement. So if they become fixed in a pattern that is ineffective and is difficult, it's very difficult to reverse that process. So you're looking for variability in movement, and not just as a kind of fine stage, but in the early stage, how much do they keep changing what they're doing? Because they're trying to find effective strategies to move. And what you want to do is enable them to find the most effective strategy for the level of skill that they have, according to the kind of intrinsic factors of the person. And then, once they've perfected that, be able to use it in a range of different situations. Anybody have questions? You've written